Most people at Palantir are kind of like 25 and look 12. So usually, like, day begins with some 12-year-old looking person telling me how wrong I am. And the day ends with a 12-year-old looking person telling me how wrong I am. And in between, they tell me how wrong I am. And it's just like, lots of problems we have internally. In tech, we have a number of innovations, but I would say most of them are on the product side, but then they're the result of a culture that is very flat.
Alex Karp's bold vision for America's dominance will leave you speechless. Check this video out.
So below me, there are 3 or 4 direct reports, and then everyone else has only a fake title to be used at a company, so someone takes them seriously even though they look 18. And so, as you've seen, we have a global business. It's now mostly in America because America's growing so quickly. We have essentially, it's split up into verticals: government, commercial inside and outside of America, where commercial and government inside America is by far the most important part. And so it's like problem solving. Most of my time is spent, I hired the first 400 or 500 people. We believe in managing peak talent, so we want people, we hire some of the smartest people in the world, and we've been famous for that, but then we really are trying to teach them that they're probably, the way I explain it to them is it was, by the way, an incredible introduction, and I wish my parents were here. The one thing that I'm incredibly dyslexic, and I basically tell everybody I've managed now 8,000 people, and only one of them actually wasn't dyslexic. It's just everyone else didn't realize they weren't dyslexic. I'm spending a lot of my time getting people to work on the thing they're really the best in the world at, and accept that even though they got great grades and everything else, it's just not valuable for us. And that takes a lot of time and energy and therapy. In the beginning, I was explaining to them why it was mostly dudes. It's like, well, if I'm so smart, why can't I get a date? And that was a lot of my day. So now we've kind of gravitated to more normal industrial problems. We're very opinionated. I believe that Western institutions and the West are a superior way to live, and we've fought for that. For me, that means meritocracy, free markets. First, Second, Third Amendment's not super relevant unless somebody moves into your house, but the Fourth Amendment. And that has often been very unpopular for almost a decade and a half in Silicon Valley, the idea that you would build your company around helping the US government was viewed as kind of stupid, which in Silicon Valley is worse than being bad. And so we were very controversial, and that's changed a lot, partly because people realized it was wrong, and quite frankly, because if somebody makes a lot of money on something, then it'd be right. So we've changed the world by humiliating people and getting rich. It's the most effective way for social change, is humiliate your enemy and make them poorer. And that's how social change actually happens. And so I think Palantir alumni really played a huge role in that. But the controversy has been a really big part of our DNA, and being very unpopular for 17, 18 years, even in the DoD. In the beginning, we started with our first product was a product to basically reconcile databases so that you could find terrorists and not violate civil liberties. The central idea was, if you just found terrorists but violated civil liberties, what would be the point? The end goal of a better Western society would not be achieved. But if you just did civil liberties, you'd have lots of terror attacks, and eventually you'd have no civil liberties. So that was our core product. That product still powers most intel clandestine anti-terror organizations in the West. And then we entered the DoD, where, jumping forward a lot, we built Project Maven. We ended up building it because Google decided that it couldn't support the US military. Google's now changed a lot, but that was the first actual use of AI to identify and effectively target our enemies on the battlefield. And then in between, we developed commercial products, probably less interesting, but they are driving at least half our market cap. But consistent all the way through was being unpopular for supporting special operators, being unpopular for supporting the DoD, being unpopular for stopping terror attacks, as crazy as it seems. And we have whole governments, like the Communist Party in France has it in their commanding doctrine that if they ever win, the first thing they'll do is fire Palantir, which is I'm very proud of. So send that to our shareholders, please.
Palantir didn't just build software, they built a culture around peak talent, patriotism, and deep contrarian conviction. That's what set them apart in a valley obsessed with trend following.
I want to come back to this notion that you guys were unpopular across so many years and how that drove your business. But many of our members know what Palantir does. Some I'm sure don't. Hopefully they're shareholders. Some I'm sure don't. For those who don't, how would you describe what you guys do, what you bring to your customers?
The most important thing we've done for you is help establish dominance on the battlefield with the DoD and stop hundreds of terror attacks. It grew 71% last quarter, and we're at a pretty significant scale. We make money on our money, which is unusual in software. People have growth, but no profitability. We have a lot of both. There's hundreds of use cases we're doing in the commercial space, but we were years ahead for lots of reasons of anticipating what operational AI would mean, meaning AI where you make more money or your revenue goes up and your costs go down. And our platforms are built to use large language models and machine learning in a way that is actually operationally effective. And we had a relatively privileged insight into how you would do that and built this thing called an ontology, which manages large language models in a way where they become crazily useful, both commercially and actually on the battlefield. Typical use cases are underwriting, managing acquisition of real estate at scale, construction at scale, supply chain management, anywhere we have volatility, understanding the true cost of your inputs into your enterprise, which is super hard to do at scale, especially if things are shifting or there are disruptions, reimagining your business into a digital as opposed to a non-digital business. And then our claim to fame really is we absorb the risk of creating value, which is the typical way you build software, that we absorb the risk of value creation. So like you will make more money, your enterprise will work better. That's been a bonanza, and we're pretty much alone in doing that in the world. But the truth is, we're also riding the back of the fact that this is just an American revolution. And we had a very unique idea of how to use the technologies. And the classic Silicon Valley way up till recently was just buy some large language model and have a nice chat with it, and that really doesn't create any actual enterprise value. That part of our business is very, very strong. In America, it's actually harder in continental Europe, but I think eventually they'll come around to seeing that most enterprises that are successful will become hardware, software enterprises.
Most software companies boast about saving time or boosting productivity. Palantir is out here saying, we prevented terror attacks. That's a totally different category of impact. It reframes the company, not just as a software vendor, but as an extension of national security infrastructure. It's no wonder their value proposition to governments is almost untouchable.
So when you guys showed up in the early days with the DoD and you were offering your services, I take it you were not the prototypical company offering your services. What kind of reaction did you get, and how did you convince the skeptics to give you a shot?
Well, there were two parts of many of you know this, but there's the special operations part of the warfighting, and there the reception was actually pretty much, we don't care how freaky you are, if the thing works, we'll use it. And that's where we got off the ground. Our product was used to identify, basically do predictive analytics on where improvised explosives were going to be placed. And that saved a lot of lives, and also even people home with less injuries. The adoption in special operations was very different than in other places. So I would say operational components of Intel and operational components of the Special Operations Command are flatter, and because they're flatter, like the leadership and the people who are de facto risking their lives are more in dialogue. And so even though they have a lot less money, they tend to have more flexibility in procurement, and they're less likely to buy some BS thing that takes 80 years to build that's never going to work. And then that went reasonably well. although it was very hard, and up until recently, no one else succeeded at even that. Now they have a lot of defense tech startups. The DoD was spending, I think it was like $26 billion, 26. By the way, when their accounting doesn't include things like employees, buildings, flights, so normal things that you have to account for, salaries. It's like 26 billion of pure, just like cash. But rebuilding a product we wanted to sell to them for, I think, a couple million a month. And then we couldn't get them. Eventually, we had to sue them. And by the way, the golden rule of working with the US government is thou shalt not never sue the US government. The most famous, I won't mention their names, but literally the most famous people in government came into my office and they were like, if you sue the US government, everyone will find out you're an asshole and you'll never work there again. First of all, I didn't really view myself that way, but it's nice to see how I was viewed. I told them, but if we don't change procurement, we're going to be selling like 1940s technology to the DoD for the next 50 years, and America's going to be in a terrible place. And so then, we sued the US government, and of course you never win, but we won. And then the U.S. government, the discovery literally was, we know their product is the best, we know our product will never work, and we hate them, therefore we're not going to buy it. This is literally what they were writing. And so then they appealed, and we sued them again, and then we won. And then for about 10 years, we were like, well, the French, like Eskimos have 1,000 words for snow. The French have 1,000 words for a mister or a mistress. We were like the mistress of the mistress of the like we were allowed to be met. We would have these meetings where they were like, we're buying your product, but could you meet us in the parking lot in the right corner behind the truck? And then we'd always have to promise to rename the product so that no one would ever find out it was us. And this went on for really 6, 7, 8 years until about 2 years ago. And yeah, now basically, partly because it was used in Ukraine effectively in ways that are well known, in many ways that are not well known, in the Middle East, both known and unknown, and it's now, demand for it is more than we can satiate. So that's, and arguably more importantly, there are a lot of probably people in this room who are investors or involved in doing defense tech startups. That whole ecosystem really got, because we didn't sue the government to buy our product. We sued the government for a different kind of procurement system so that you could prove the merit of your product and they would have to buy the product that works. I mean, it seems obvious, but before that, you would deliver, and still do sometimes, a 30,000 page, complete BS document. That in the software, that's just not how it works. I could tell you how the software works, but you have to see it in action. So the fact that, essentially we helped bring meritocracy to the DoD, and now there's, hundreds of billions of dollars investment, including people who compete with us who are bringing innovation to America and our allies. And you see the difference between what we can do and what other parts of the world can do on the battlefield. In defense, it's not really how much you spend, it's on whom you spend it. So it's just crucial to get more competent at tech. The legacy companies also do really important things, but you kind of need, because they have scale. You can't really build certain kinds of things without massive scale. But then over time, I imagine half the budget will be.
This is the kind of story that rewrites the rules of government tech. Most companies would have folded at the first threat. Palantir sued the US government twice, not just to win a contract, but to force a system built on favoritism to finally reward performance. That move wasn't just brave, it was historic. It cleared the runway for a wave of defense innovation we're only just beginning to see, and the irony, they were punished for building the best product until reality finally caught up.
People whose companies are newer.
I think you got the gist by now that Palantir hasn't gotten where the company is today by following the crowd and doing things a predictable way. I know that the Palantir culture is something you're very proud of. I'm very curious, is it something that just happened organically over the years? Is it something that you curated from the beginning? And if the latter, were you as focused on what you did not want to become culturally as you were on what you wanted to become?
Well, there is a lot of that, but in the beginning, first of all, the beginning was 5 of us. So it was, Peter Thiel, who was a buddy of mine, very famous now, Joe Lonsdale, Stephen Cohen, Nathan Gettings, and I. And that these are exceedingly talented, I think most people would say brilliant people. We had a culture of pretty deep intellectual rigor. One of the things we do at Palantir that isn't, first of all, I think we found the best of the best of the best. The Silicon Valley used to hate us because they were like, you're stealing the best people for your clown show. Like, why aren't you building cockroach.com with these talented people? And so, we got the very, very, very best people we could find, and then got them to get their friends, and we made make a list of their 5 smartest friends, and then we would recruit them. That we did this for, I was still doing this. And then we have this thing called 5 Whys, which is like essentially, Peter and I are, Peter was born in Germany. My father's side of family were German Jews, and so I did a PhD in German, and so like this kind of, why is there a cockroach on the table? There's a cockroach on the table because we got to clean the table. Why did we clean the table? Because the person is drunk. Why is the person drunk? Because they're unhappy. You go on and on and on and on, and that roots out a lot of dysfunction and lies. And you need that to build very deep products that are painful to build. I would say a couple of the things I was super into was essentially this flat, non-hierarchical peer culture, which is hugely frustrating sometimes, but that also allows you to have a lot of honesty in the culture. Meritocracy. We retest everyone. It doesn't matter what school you went to, what grades you have, or what school you didn't go to. We do not care. We have no form of bigotry. Even in peak wokeness, where we had these absurd things we were supposed to fill out, we got sued by the government for discriminating against Asian people, which no one in Silicon Valley is discriminating against Asian people. It's ridiculous. We hire very opinionated, difficult, free-thinking fanatics. Those are the people that do the best at Palantir. And you need to be able to absorb a lot of pain if you're going to stay for more than a couple of years, because the pain of dealing with an enterprise that's not your own is pretty significant if your enterprise is single-purpose focused on building software platforms, which is just not the way normal enterprises work. We are pretty anti-experience, so where we've really struggled was lateral hires. We've been very bad at that. We only recently made a couple pretty strong lateral, in the government. We hired this pretty well-known Congressman Mike Gallagher and 1 or 2 other people, very talented, and that seems to be going very well. But our initial forays into hiring anyone who had any experience was complete roadshow disaster. They leave our building screaming. I actually became CEO because we couldn't figure out why we needed a CEO, and we didn't want anyone telling us what to do. I do think serving a higher purpose, like the U.S. government or the West, really has been an integrating principle for us. And then I would say on the negative side, I like some of the people who don't like us, we really don't like either. So that's been pretty motivating for me. And I think the people who stay at Palantir, it's the positive of you get to do really cool things, and the negative of.
This is the kind of method that would break most orgs. It's painful, it's invasive, it's slow, but it also forces intellectual honesty. When you build tools for national security and complex enterprise environments, you can't afford to build on delusions. The 5 Whys approach is how you pressure test not just the code, but the people. And over time, that filters out anyone who can't sit in discomfort and solve problems without resorting to politics or platitudes.
I definitely want to come back to the criticism piece, because you guys have had no shortage of praise, and I'm sure you've got you've had your critics as well. But I am curious about, I know you're obsessed with meritocracy. You are a person who's well educated, you have multiple degrees, you've got a law degree, you've got a PhD degree. Interestingly, you've also launched the Meritocracy Fellowship, hiring young talent right out of high school and skipping college. Tell us about your thinking there.
Well, I really believe in elite educational institutions, and I benefited. I think I learned the most actually at my magnet school at Central, but then I went to Haverford, which is, and then Stanford, and then the University of Frankfurt appears to be a city school, but at the time it was where the intellectual elite of a certain kind of philosophy were kind of gathered, so it was in practice very elite. And in a classic sense, I am a progressive, and so I could not be more frustrated at our elite universities. I just think like the damage they've done. Of course, I'm super in favor of free expression, but allowing the universities to be captured by what amounts to a pagan religion is beyond belief to me. And I'm going to do everything in my power, which largely means not giving a cent and allowing people who otherwise would go to those institutions to come to Palantir, which currently has a more valuable degree, and encouraging everyone else to do this that I can. And whatever side of the spectrum you're on politically, ineptitude does not serve the Enlightenment at all, ever. And when you look at the college presidents defending whatever they were defending, I actually think the single most depressing thing is, who made these guys president? Like, what is this? Like, I'd rather have them come out and say, I have a weird way of thinking and it's just how I think, but this is how I think, as opposed to some intellectual gyration. Now again, I'm very much on the pro-free speech side, but I do think having institutions in the West that are intellectually captured is a very big problem. I don't think the answer is to restrict what people can say, but one way to defeat an adversary is just to make them less important. And so, I also think there's a lot of my views, and by the way, some of these are just there's a lot of unfairness in the system. I hear story after story of people who have indisputably excellent credentials and get turned down from every school. And that pisses me off. So then, now if you steel man it, I do think we have a general problem with testing aptitude, and that what we need from people in kind of a more AI-driven world, we don't know how to test for that. And so one of the things I want to do, so the people who've applied have been crazy, qualified. But now I'm trying to also figure out, well, how can we do testing for people who, might be valuable because they're creative, and maybe they don't look like the classic person that applies to Harvard when Harvard was Harvard.
Karp's vision gets really interesting. For a guy with multiple elite degrees, launching a program that deliberately bypasses college isn't just symbolic, it's insurgent. He's not just critiquing academia from the outside, he's building a competing system from the inside. And what's wild is that it's working. In a world where credentials used to mean everything, Palantir's saying, show us your ability, not your diploma.
Over the last several years, the word inclusivity has been huge in academia and in corporate America. Are you suggesting that for the elite universities to become elite once more, they need to embrace argument inclusivity and the ability to have rigorous debate on campus?
Well, the obvious thing that should happen is there should be merit-based things. And yes, intellectual inclusivity includes hearing an opinion of somebody who might be conservative. It's crazy. I'm always asking, if you're so certain of your opinion, why don't you want to hear the other opinion? It's like, and you can look, but I think we are going to have to refactor what we mean by talent, because I do think we don't quite understand. If you took the highest testing people in the world I don't think they would be the most performant in business inherently. And so, like, there is a question of how do we test, how do we understand what business acumen, as an example, how would you test for business acumen? Business acumen is crazy valuable, not just in business, but in building a foundation, building a publishing house that might be philanthropic or not, building a career. I don't think we know how you test for that, except for somebody who has business acumen says that person has business acumen and they promote you. That's so like apprenticing people, more vocational plus AI training plus slotting people. We slot people very quickly. If we see that, or if I see that someone is crazy talented at X, they move the next day. And I think that's how all institutions are going to have to work. The other thing is, I think there are real values to being well-rounded, but in the kind of AI software context we're in, being single value, creative, like the AI is commoditizing things that are not unique. So being unique and creative at something is more important than being B- at it. So, and those things are very hard to replicate. Like, I was playing around with the chat box and I was asking a mathematical formula for measuring fluidity in a pipe with certain kinds of blockages. The answers are mathematical, they're all the same. And then I went back and asked, well, explain Heidegger's concept of phenomenology and to compare that to Schutz. And the answer is gobbledygook, because you'd have to be an expert to understand who's an expert. And I think all the value is in the latter. And it's the same, so you see this in business context, like someone who's talented at business can pick out someone who's talented at business, but someone who's not can't. Figuring out how to rebuild society, and America is in the exact right position to do this, because as opposed to Germany, we're very plastic and very flexible and not super ideological. We're very pragmatic. We just want it to work. We don't actually have an idea of how it has to work. We just want it to work. And work is defined by the inputs are smaller than the outputs. And then we have, there's lots of ways to capture that. But I think if you kind of, not that I would want to be overly fair to our elite universities, because they're not being fair to us with the quality of dialogue they're producing, but I would say there is a much harder problem there than one might realize, because what is going to be, in the end, what they're promising to do is to produce people that are more successful and more thoughtful and happier. But to do that, you're going to need a different way of studying and doing and slotting people than what we've had in the past. And you're going to have very different ways of testing people. And so that's a super hard problem. And maybe a overly fair version of it is they just decide to put their head in the sand because it's a hard problem, and if you only have people that think one way, you can't solve it.
No doubt. Well, you mentioned AI, so let's keep pulling on the AI thread. You were into AI before AI was cool, and what do you think businesses and societies today are getting wrong about AI, and what are they getting right?
Well, it's interesting. For most of American history, tech was built on the battlefield and then dual-purposed into civil life. And that was one of the reasons America had a certain kind of cohesion and was able to then expand socially on the back of that economic growth, innovation power. And then with the rise of kind of consumer internet, you had single-purpose commercial products. And we intuitively believe, most of us, that the innovation will be single-purpose commercial, but in reality, I think it's interesting, if you got classified briefings on AI from our adversaries or from our allies, what you would find is the revolution has really begun, and we're in an arms race to see who can harness it and how quickly, and that will determine who controls the order of the world. And so I think most people either don't believe that's true or don't know it's true. They don't believe it's true because typically in the last 20 years that's not been the case, period, where the rules that applied for most of history apply again, and the rules that we thought were abrogated are not abrogated. So I think that's demonstrably true, and many people don't believe it's true or know it's true, but I would venture to say everybody who's has a stake in the game and a leadership role in the world knows this to be true and is very, very focused on this, and focused, if there are adversaries, on catching up and surpassing America, which is possible and could happen.
This is a crucial point that too few are willing to confront openly. AI is not just a commercial innovation or academic curiosity, it's a strategic asset in a global arms race. The idea that America's historical technological dominance was rooted in military innovation, and that AI is following that pattern, puts the current developments in a new light. He's basically saying that the stakes of AI development are geopolitical and existential. Whoever leads AI will shape the future world order. The fact that many people in the general public and even in business don't realize this underscores a dangerous complacency. Leaders and governments are acutely aware, though, and are racing to maintain or gain the upper hand. This calls for urgent attention and serious policy thinking, not just hype about AI chatbots and consumer apps.
So given how fast things are moving on this front, is it safe to assume that AI is already in the hands of bad actors? How worried about that should we be, and what can the U.S. do to mitigate that risk?
Well, I mean, bad actors is a broad term, but we are primarily in a race with China as our most important peer adversary, and Russia as an adversary I think people underestimate in America, and then to some extent with Iran, but Iran is much more like light hardware production, and meaning drones. And then there's obviously all sorts of cyber ways that would be under the rubric of bad actors. Korea. One of the things that, though, is often underestimated is you have professional bad and non-professional bad in a gray zone. And most of the really bad stuff happens where you have professional actors and even the non-professional people. They're doing it with some kind of sanctioning with professionals. And so we're in a full-on arms race. And the thing about AI that is, it's like a plethora of riches for America because all the relevant companies basically are here. But AI is not an egalitarian technology. And so, and even though I believe it will raise the GDP of America and help poorer people, it's going to take severe interventions to help poor people anywhere near as much as it will help wealthier people. And so we have a problem in the West of relative deprivation in America, where I think we'll be the leaders of the world. We are. But then how do we bring along the rest of society who's also doing better? But if you get 10 times wealthier and I get 20% wealthier, I might not be happy with you. It really does matter in social change. It's the relative impact more than the absolute impact. It is a technology that I think will be more easy for that reason to adapt in more tribal cultures. So I think the Middle East is going to adopt AI very, very effectively, because a country run by a tribe can really deal with these issues very easily. And then on the commercial and military front, especially the military front, we have a long list of advantages, but on the disadvantage side, AI, software, hardware, AI systems employ less people than large-scale hardware implementation. So if you're China or you're a society run by one person, it's easier to say, well, we're shifting our economy from here to here. That's a slower function in a democracy. And it will be a particularly big issue in Europe, because a lot of these programs are set up so that they are for defense, but they also supply a lot of jobs. So you want to go to the local governor of a province and say, but we'd be more effective buying Palantir than having 5,000 jobs. That's a kind of a loser argument. And so, like, there's going to be some attenuation in the West, even though we have these, essentially. But I would say it's the advantage of essentially being able to purchase indigenous technology, meaning from our country, is just invaluable. No other country in the world really has that at this scale. And it's going to be very hard to catch up because we all have all these kind of micro networks of who does what and how they do it, and capital structures that are the result of success, in my view, but that give us a lot of advantage. But again, on the disadvantage side is how do we mitigate, how do we make sure that people have skills so that they could participate in this in some way, and then how do we transition on the military side to a more accurate, that's actually going very well currently, and is much better in the US than any other Western country by far, for lots and lots of reasons, but certainly on a comparative basis, there's no country in the West that is moving as quickly as we are to adopt at scale things that work.
But on the business front, as this momentum continues with AI and adoption continues, is the implication to the worker that there has to be reskilling, there has to be upskilling because the jobs they've known will be harder to come by?
I think that, and I also think we're going to find out that you have workers who have aptitude at this that are unaware of it. So I think there's going to be a whole testing component, figuring out ways to train people to work with essentially AI-driven products. Now, there is the kind of positive side of that is, for example, in manufacturing, a lot of manufacturing is actually culturally specific. So if you want to, we work with as an example, a company that builds a very complicated Japanese product. And it really was hard to manufacture here because, we have wonderfully eager workers here and they're not Japanese. And so now you can actually provide an ability for them to interact with the Japanese product in a way that a Japanese engineer would without them having to be a Japanese engineer. Part of being a Japanese engineer also is you stay at the company for 2 decades. Your parents were there 2 decades before. That's just not how the American workforce will ever work. So there are a lot of room for being able to do things we couldn't do before. But I don't think it's just workers. I think it's like whole companies, like our Palantir culture of flat hierarchy and moving people around and having direct reports that are annoying on tech. I think that's going to be everyone's future. Like all these things look exactly the same on paper, and some really don't work, but some really do work. So being able to figure that what can work, I can only talk about publicly revealed examples, but I think like IG was talking about at their earnings, I think something was like the math was something 5x the amount of output with half the people in underwriting. That's a very big deal, and if you're not doing something similar, you're going to have a problem. And that's roughly the order of magnitude that's more than possible now. But again, how do you decipher the marginally useless thing from the thing that is crazy useful? That requires a lot of change. And again, I think that will happen pretty rapidly in America, certainly in relative terms, because we have a lot of people. One of the things that's special that we see is American workers go from company to company. So they're like, well, I did this and it worked. I did that, it didn't work. And there's just a fair bit of knowledge of what's working and what's not floating around. And I think that will happen. But it's going to be very disruptive.
So, Alex, I've known you for some time now, and you've never struck me as a person with thin skin. So my question is that true? And how do you react, if you react at all, when you read something like the recent Asia Times article that labels you as the most dangerous man in America?
Well, when the CCP article is attacking you, it feels pretty good. I get a lot of questions in private that amount to, hey, Alex, can you teach me how not to care what people think about you? But it's not actually true. Like, I do care what people think, and I actually think most of my success is pretty linked to strong upbringing and dyslexia. I think very carefully, and I do a lot of what's called steelmaning, which, like, what is the argument the person would have made if they had all the facts, And if they had all the facts and thought about it from these 3 different places, what would they then think, and what should I think? And I do a lot of that, certainly in my head. And with the unfortunate people who have to hang around with me, they get a lot of that too. But I still can't make myself believe something I think is not true. And that's just, it's like, I'm very happy to hear how terrible and how wrong and how, especially in the business context, how our business is going to fail. We heard this every day, 5 times a day for what seemed to be 100 years, but was only 18 years. And I don't know, I think if you talk to people around me, they would tell you I am listening very, very closely to their unhappiness, but it doesn't make what they're saying true. And that, one of the things about business that I really do appreciate, business to me is much more like what academia claims to be. Academia claims to be about truth, but it's really about difficult people yelling at you because they've had no impact. And they're not being honest. They're unhappy because no one's listening. And no one's listening because nothing makes any sense. And that's, whereas, if you are involved in some custodial function of managing someone's assets, whether that's the money they invested, your time, managing the time of people you respect and think are very talented, the value production for the most important institutions in the world and institutions you also care about, so government and commercial institutions, at the end of the day, the thing that will actually ameliorate and better the institution, i.e. the operational form of productized truth in our version in software, but it could be in anything, actually matters much more than what someone claims to believe is true. And to me, that's what, academia or should have been and is not, but over time, that is what business is.
Well, our time has been flying by, and before we run out of time, I've got to ask you this question. If there is one unsolved problem, personal or business, that you or Palantir would like AI to solve more than any other, what would that be?
Personal? I'd like to go back to my personal life in grad school. It's not possible to time travel, but I had a great time. And health care, solving, maladies. But the problem I care about is making America the dominant military force on the planet in a way that's so indisputable that our enemies and adversaries wake up in moderate to extreme fear and go to bed in moderate and extreme fear. And that's what I care about.
All right, so...
And the world is actually only safe where your adversaries are afraid and they don't quite know if you'll use what you have and how you use it. And that's just the law of the universe. And, and then I do believe in law and order and, rule of law, but it's only enforced on the back of that. And the older I get, the less faith I have in any other institution to even pretend to do this. It's almost not worth bashing the United Nations. It's just, what is this? And these institutions that should have worked, universities, United Nations, basic concepts of how a society should work, they've all failed. And the best and last hope we have is to make America work really, really well.
Why do you think deterrence over the decades has ebbed and flowed, the importance of it the way it has?
Because it really has ebbed and flowed in direct proportion to how much the delta between our technology superiority and everyone else's. So, we built the nuclear bomb. We built it by importing, and we imported the smartest, best, most qualified people in the world. Germany blew itself up, but we then organized them in a way that only America would have been able to do it. The whole way in which we got Los Alamos to work and the general that organized Congress and the way it was built and developed massive military superiority and actually, as relevant to this group, and economic superiority. So we had significant. The delta between us and the rest of the world was dramatic, undeniable, indisputable. And then we were super nice. If you, German history I know reasonably well post-war, I mean, we set up the whole society so Germany could succeed on its own terms and asked for nothing. And so the combination of just, military, indisputable, almost unconscionable military superiority, which in that form probably had never actually existed, and then the dominant economy in the world, then I think the lagging indicator was the dominant culture in the world, because that's something Silicon Valley and Hollywood all forgot, which is people were really interested. I spent a lot of time talking to older Germans when I was there, and they basically adopted American culture because it worked, not because they thought it would work, and then it worked. And if we want anything like that, the deterrent has to be real. And when we screw up military things, and but or where the deterrent looks like it's not real, people act up. One of the things I think, if you've lived abroad a lot, and it's in my book, which I'm not sure did very well, but I'm not advocating reading it, but there's there's this famous quote, we forget, but no one else does, that, they're paying attention to our values because they're backed up by a really big stick. And without that, the values look a lot less appealing to everybody else. It's directly proportional. And so that's why we have to reassert military superiority, and the way we will do that is with hardware, software, AI-driven hardware that America specializes in and has an advantage in.
All right, well, we're going to conclude with this one, Alex, and then we'll get you off to your next stop. But what advice would you give today's teenagers, young people, around the skills they need to develop, the things they need to acquire to be successful in this crazy environment that we live in?
Find the thing you're uniquely good at, and then make sure your whole life is organized around allowing you to do it. And so I manage essentially young people and for the last 20 years, and I would say failure one is not willing to accept what they're actually good at. It may not be what you want to be good at. Not organizing your life around that ability. I tell the people who come to Palantir, I've never met someone really successful who had a great social life at 20. If that's what you want, that's great, but you're not going to be successful, and don't blame anyone else. You have to be somewhat honest when you're doing your partner selection. If your goal is to advance your aptitude, which should be it should be focus on your aptitude and focus on your freedom and happiness, which are directly correlated. Because if you're doing something you're really good at, no one really cares what you wear to work. I ask people all the time, they're like, oh, I met someone I really like. They're like, well, what do you like about him, her? And they're like, the rest, oh, they went to this school. And I was like, okay, great. And what else do you like? Well, they went to that school. And I'm like, and what else do you like? Well, their brother's really interesting. Their sister's really interesting. It's like, well, what about the liking? Do you like them? How are they going to feel when you dedicate the next 10 years of your life to building what you think is valuable? And if you're very talented, and most people have something that they're talented at and enjoy, then focus on that. Organize your whole life around that. Don't worry so much about the money. That sounds like hypocrisy now, but I never really did. And stay off the meth, and you'll do very well.
Alex really highlights how complex the AI landscape is, especially when it comes to bad actors. It's not just some vague enemy, it's a spectrum, from professional state adversaries like China and Russia to more informal groups operating in grey zones. That complexity makes regulation and defense incredibly challenging. His point about AI not being egalitarian is crucial. Even though AI will boost overall wealth, it risks deepening inequality unless there are deliberate efforts to help those left behind. The idea that relative wealth matters more than absolute wealth gets at the heart of social tensions we're seeing today. I found the cultural insight about tribal societies adapting AI more easily very interesting, something many overlook. It suggests geopolitical shifts in who benefits most from AI advances, not just in raw power, but in social cohesion and governance style. On the military and business fronts, Alex points out the unique American advantage in indigenous AI tech. But he's also realistic about the social disruption it will cause. Workers needing to reskill, companies having to adopt radically different organizational structures, and the challenge of sorting useful AI tools from hype. His reflections on personal resilience and criticism hit home. Despite the pressure and negativity, Alex stays grounded by deeply analyzing feedback, but sticking to what he knows is true, an approach that's clearly shaped Palantir's success. Finally, his emphasis on maintaining overwhelming military deterrence as the foundation of peace is stark but pragmatic. Without that edge, he implies, global stability crumbles. It's a reminder that technology and power are inseparable in today's world, and America's future depends on leading that race while managing its disruptive side.